class, let's try this recorded lecture. Welcome to my apartment. If you happen to see a dog or one of 3 cats running around or maybe pawing at the screen or something like that, laugh. I apologize. They're just wondering what's going on. This is Chapter 6, the integumentary system. Show the slides up here on the TV screen. Let's see if we can get through this. Alright, so the integumentary system. Here's another body system. We're finally getting into systems. We talked about chemicals, we talked about cells, we talked about tissues. Now we're going to start talking about systems. And the first one we're going to talk about, integumentary system. With the integumentary system, we're talking about the skin and also its derivatives, so nails, hair, sweat glands, sebaceous glands. Obviously the integument, the skin covering the body. Also known as the cutaneous membrane, because we're going to see where in a lot of ways it acts like the plasma membrane of cells as far as separating the external environment from the internal environment. Realize, again, barrier to the outside world, a visual indicator of our health. You know, when people say, hey, you look kind of pale, you know, maybe when you're nauseous. If you have yellow skin, liver problems, that can be a visual indicator of health, and that's our skin doing that. This study of skin is called dermatology. Anything that ends in ology is the study of. Derm, we're going to see where dermis is one of the layers of the skin. So dermatology, that's how we get that term. Alright, so here's our objectives. We're going to talk about the 5 layers of the skin. We're going to talk about differences between thick skin and thin skin. And we're going to see where the thin skin has 1 less layer. It only has 4 layers. Thick skin has 5. We'll talk just a little bit about the differences in skin color. But that is one of the things that I crossed out in this lecture. Also, 2 layers of the dermis. We've got a layer that's above it. There's 2 layers of the dermis. We'll talk about cleavage lines, and especially the importance that they have with injuries and surgery. We'll talk about how the blood vessels that we find in the dermis are important for temperature regulation, also a little bit for blood pressure regulation. Also, we're going to talk about the function of the subcutaneous layer, which really isn't a part of the integumentary system, but since it's so closely associated with it, we're going to talk about it here. Alright, so again, the integument, the skin, the cutaneous membrane, largest organ in the body. Again, it's a barrier between the inside world and the outside world, so part of its function is to protect those internal body structures, organs, other tissues, other systems. The skin weighs about 7 to 8% of our total body weight. The actual surface area, about 1.5 to 2 meters squared. That's where all the skin covers everything, and its thickness ranges between 1.5 and 4 millimeters. Alright, realize Chapter 5 we talked about the 4 types of tissue. Realize that the skin, the integumentary system, is comprised of all 4 of those types of tissues. This is one of the few places where we're going to find that. You've got an epithelial tissue that covers the surface of it. We've got connective tissue underneath it, and that connects it to the systems deeper to it. We also have muscle tissue that's in the piloerector hairs. And finally, we have nervous tissue that's providing information about things like pressure and temperature. Alright, so here's a picture. Hopefully it comes out okay on the video as far as the integument, the skin, and the 3 big layers that we're going to talk about. The top layer, the superficial layer, that's the epidermis. The middle layer, that's the dermis, and we'll talk about the 2 layers that make up the dermis. And then finally this 3rd layer that again technically isn't part of the skin, but we're going to talk about it with this system because it's so closely associated with it. It's the deepest layer, the subcutaneous layer. Alright, so again, that's what we talked about, the layers of the skin. Again, the most superficial is composed of stratified squamous epithelium. That means rows of squamous or pancake-shaped cells that are of the epithelial tissue type. The dermis, the deeper layer there, primarily has dense irregular connective tissue. So again, here's the epidermis, the superficial layer, and then the dermis, it's thicker. There's the deeper layer. Then deeper to that, you've got connective tissue, muscle, bone, depending upon where you are in the body. Alright, here's the third layer again, and again, technically this isn't part of the integumentary system, but because it's associated so closely with it, we're going to talk about it. This one's deep to the dermis. The subcutaneous layer, sub means under the cutaneous membrane. That's how it gets its name. So realize, that it's a layer of alveolar and connective tissue. Hypodermis is another name for it. Alright, so here's a figure that's in your textbook showing all those layers. Again, right here you've got the epidermis. Right here you've got the dermis, and then below it, here's the subcutaneous layer. So realize that the first two layers, here's technically the integument, the cutaneous membrane, the integumentary system. Here's the subcutaneous layer down here. Here's all the derivatives, and realize that all of these glands and hairs and vessels we consider to be a part of the integumentary system. Here's muscle, here's nervous tissue, here are glands, here's connective tissue. So again, all four of those tissue types found in the integumentary system. Alright, so let's start with the superficial layer, the epidermis. Realize that we talked about it was made of stratified squamous epithelium, that it's also made of a type of epithelium that's keratinized. We're going to talk about what keratin is and what it does. It has specific layers or strata, just like rocks would, that we find everywhere, no matter where the skin is. It's going to have specific layers to it. Alright, so again, epidermis, the superficial layer. Alright, here are these layers. Realize that this table is going from deep to superficial, and that's how we're going to talk about it. Is the deepest layer, stratum basale. And we're going to talk about these names, what they mean, where the names come from. But the deepest layer, stratum basale, stratum spinosum, stratum granulosum, stratum lucidum, and finally the stratum corneum is the most superficial layer in this table. Realize that the first three layers, so actually the deepest three layers, are composed of living cells, living keratinocytes. The two most superficial, so these two right here, the lucidum and the corneum, those actually have dead keratinocytes. And again, we're going to talk about why that's true. So here's a photomicrograph, again, of the epidermis. Here's the epidermis right here. Here are the layers of it. Now we'll go from superficial to deep. Here's the stratum corneum, here's the stratum lucidum, here's the stratum granulosum, the stratum spinosum, and finally the stratum basale. I apologize, it's a little bit cut off my TV here. Alright, so again, descriptive-wise, let's talk about the base and the deepest layers first, because we're going to see where the cells start at the base and they migrate their way up. So here's the stratum basale, again, the deepest layer in the epidermis, also known as stratum dermatavium, or the basal layer. It's a single layer of cuboidal to low columnar cells. So remember that the top layers were stratified squamous cells. Here, we've got a single layer of cuboidal to low columnar cells. So it's attached to an underlying basement membrane. This is what actually separates the epidermal layer from the dermal layer. So we've got three cell types here. The big one is the keratinocytes. But we also have melanocytes, and we also have tactile cells in this layer, the stratum basale. Alright, so keratinocytes. Again, the majority of the cells that are found in this layer. We actually find them in all the layers too, just again, the deepest three, they're alive. The top two, they're actually dead in. So here in the stratum basale, the basement layer, we've got the stem cells. Those are the cells that are going to divide, provide us with new keratinocytes, while the stem cells remain in this bottom layer. Stem cells have the ability to divide, and again, that's what they're going to do down here. So realize that skin, part of its protective nature, is that the cells will slough off, either naturally or through pressure, through stress, through abrasion. The cells get sloughed off, so I need to replace them. So the stratum basale is where these replacement cells come from. The stem cells divide, then we're going to see where they start pushing their way up to the superficial layers. So keratinocytes, the name is derived from the fact that they synthesize keratin, which is a protein that's going to strengthen the cells and thereby strengthen the epidermis. Keratinocytes, again, the stem cells form found in the stratum basale, the basement layer, the deepest layer. Alright, the second cell type that we see in the stratum basale, melanocytes. You've probably heard about melanin. Don't confuse it with melatonin. That's a substance that makes us sleepy, regulates the sleep-wake cycle. This is melanin. So this is what makes us look tan, is melanocytes. These cells are scattered among these keratinocytes, and these keratinocyte stem cells, they produce and store melanin, which is a pigment, so it would be an inclusion in the cells. They do this in response to ultraviolet light. You think about it. As you lay out in the sun, or as you go to a tanning salon, you're exposed to ultraviolet light. Your skin becomes more tan. That's the process here. Your melanocytes are picking up on that ultraviolet radiation. They are producing and storing melanin. They store them in melanosomes. So the melanin's in melanosomes. They actually transfer these melanosomes to the keratinocytes. The melanocytes are going to stay down in the basement membrane where they do their job. That's making melanin, making the melanosomes. Then they're going to move those melanosomes to keratinocytes, and as the keratinocytes move up in the layers, we're going to see where that helps. The melanosomes, the melanin pigment, it accumulates around the nucleus of these keratinocytes, these skin cells. This pigment helps protect the keratinocytes' nuclear DNA from damage, so we're preventing mutations in it that would cause skin cancer. That's what the melanin's doing. Also, visual indicator, yes, the melanin is responsible for darker tones of skin. Alright, last type of cells, tactile cells. These are nervous tissue. Another name for them is Merkel cells. Relatively few in number, so the most were keratinocytes, then we have the melanocytes, now we've got tactile cells. These are sensitive to pressure, so we're going to find these in the stratum basale. When we talk about nervous tissue at the end of the semester, we'll talk about exactly how it works, but when they're stimulated, they release chemicals that's picked up by the nervous system. But these Merkel cells found in the stratum basale, we're going to see where some other types of nervous tissue are actually found deeper down in the dermis. This is the only one that's found in the epidermis. Alright, second deepest layer. So we have the stratum basale. Here's the stratum spinosum, so one layer superficial to it. It's also known as the spiny layer. And this is because when slides of skin are prepared to look under the microscope, these cells lose a little bit of their contents, and so they appear to have a bunch of jagged edges, spines. So that's why this layer was called the stratum spinosum. It's several layers of polygonal keratinocytes. So realize again, we've got keratinocyte stem cells that were dividing down the basal layer. As they divide, the older cells get pushed up, so they're getting pushed up into the stratum spinosum. Here we've got living keratinocytes, but the big thing is that they are starting to specialize into non-dividing keratinocytes in this layer right here. We talked about desmosomes in Chapter 4. Those are the junctions that basically have fibers in between the cells. They help with stress. Think about it, our skin has to move. As all of our limbs move, as our bodies move, it's got to stretch over things. And so we're going to see where the skin cells are subjected to a lot of stress. That's when we have these desmosomes that act as the junctions in between these cells, and particularly in the stratum spinosum. Alright, also in the stratum spinosum, we find epidermal dendritic cells. They're also known as Langerhans cells. These are immune cells. So since the skin's the largest organ, it's also the barrier between the external environment and the internal environment. It's going to see a lot of potential invaders, a lot of potential foreign substances to the body. So here is an obvious place for immune system cells to occur. Again, in the epidermis, the stratum spinosum, this is one of the first places that we see them. Is that these cells, they detect something that's foreign, they will initiate an immune response. They can also help eradicate cancer cells that arise from the epidermis. They're found in the stratum spinosum. Alright, third layer up, middle layer. stratum granulosum. Is the other two were pretty much 1 to a few layers. Here we've got a little bit more. Here's 3 to 5 layers of keratinocytes, also known as the granular layer. So here's where keratinization, which is the process where keratinocytes start to fill up with this protein that we first mentioned several slides ago called keratin. Here's where that process starts, is in this layer, the stratum granulosum. Is basically these keratinocytes, again, they started dividing in the stratum basale, they moved up to the stratum spinosum, now they've moved up to the stratum granulosum. Is here these cells are going to start filling with keratin, and they're going to fill all the way up with keratin. In doing that, they're going to destroy their nucleus and their organelles. They're essentially going to die, but they're going to be filled with keratin. Now, here's the last layer, this third layer from the deepest point, the middle layer. Here's the last layer at which these keratinocytes are still considered alive. Above this, superficial this, the keratinocytes will be filled with keratin. They won't have a nucleus or organelles, so they'll be considered dead. Now realize again that the process starts down here in the stratum granulosum, but it doesn't finish until we reach either that second to the superficial or the most superficial layer. So it starts down here. Alright, fourth layer. From the bottom, or second layer from the top, the stratum lucidum. Again, here's another 2 or 3 layers of cells. This one's known as the clear layer. So we have the granular layer, now we've got the clear layer. The big thing is that this layer, the stratum lucidum, is only found in thick skin. And we're going to talk about the difference in thin and thick skin in a couple of slides. Only in thick skin do we find this layer of the stratum lucidum. If we have thin skin, then we've only got 4 layers. We've got basal, spinosum, the granular layer, and then the corneum, the horny layer that we'll talk about here in a minute. With thick skin, we've got all 5 layers present. The cells in the stratum lucidum have actually a translucent protein, eliodin. Here's an intermediate product in the maturation of keratin. So again, the big thing that this layer right here, the stratum lucidum, is only found in thick skin. If we've got thin skin, this layer doesn't exist. Alright, last layer, the most superficial one. Here's the stratum corneum, also known as the horny layer. So again, we had 1 layer of cells, 2 or 3 layers of cells. Now we've got many layers of cells, 20 to 30. These are dead, interlocking, squamous keratinocytes are filled with keratin. Because all that keratin has gotten rid of the nucleus and the organelles. Realize that this makes the surface of the skin very unsuitable for a lot of microorganisms to grow, not all of them. I mean, it's beyond the scope of this class, but we have a population of bacteria that grows in our skin that's supposed to be there, that also helps prevent invaders. But realize that this surface where we don't have living cells, we've got cells that are packed with keratin, that's actually pretty unsuitable for a lot of organisms to grow in. This is the most superficial layer right here. It's also the thickest. Alright, so again, we talked about that the keratinocytes, the skin cells, they're migrating, they're moving. They start in the stratum basale, that's where the stem cells are dividing to produce new keratinocytes. They move up, and as they do that, they fill with keratin. They keratinize. Once they get to the superficial layers, they're filled with keratin, and the cells themselves are dead. Once they reach a stratum corneum, again, over time, either they will slough off on their own, or pressure, abrasion, chemicals, anything like that will wear them off. It takes about 2 weeks to go from the basal to the corneum, so our skin renews itself basically about every 2 weeks. If, assuming that nothing happens to them, they will stay, the dead keratinocytes will stay in the stratum corneum for about 2 weeks. And again, because it takes about 2 weeks for a new cell to go from the stratum basale to the corneum, is that if that cell is still left after 2 weeks, it's now being replaced by new dead keratinocytes. So all of the cells of the stratum corneum basically slough off in about 2 weeks. Alright, here's another picture that's in your textbook. And again, the layers of the epidermis. And here's the stratum corneum right here, the thickest layer. Stratum lucidum, this would only be found in thick skin, so we must have a section of thick skin here. Stratum granulosum, 3 to 5 layers. Stratum spinosum, and then finally that single layer of cuboidal to low columnar cells. Here's the stratum basale. And then deeper to that, we've got the dermis. Alright, so realize that we can get variations in the skin. We can get variations in the epidermis, depending upon where we are in the body. Again, one of the big ones, thick skin versus thin skin. Between individuals, we can get variations in color tones and also in markings. We're not going to go very much over them, but realize that, yes, there could be variations in the epidermis. Alright, the big one, thick skin versus thin skin. Again, we went over it. Thick skin has all 5 layers. Thin skin is lacking the stratum lucidum, so thin skin only has 4 layers. So thick skin, only found in relatively few places in the human body. The palms of the hands, the soles of the feet, the surface of the fingers and toes. So if you think about it, places where we would see lots and lots of friction, abrasion, pressure, movement, hands and feet. Again, all 5 layers. You've got sweat glands there. Think about it, you break into a cold sweat for some reason, that usually makes your hands and even your feet sweaty. It's because there's thick skin there that has sweat glands. Thick skin does not have hair follicles or sebaceous glands. You can imagine from its name, yes, thick skin is literally thicker than thin skin. It has one more layer of cells. So here's a picture. Here's where thick skin is found. Again, the palms, the soles, and again the surface of the fingers and the toes. Here's where thin skin is found, the rest of the body. So again, we saw this slide earlier, but here would be a section of thick skin, corneum, lucidum, granulosum, spinosum, basale. Here would be thick skin. If it's missing the stratum lucidum, we've got thin skin. Alright, so that was thick skin. Again, thin skin, the big thing, it has a stratum lucidum. Anywhere besides the hands and the feet and the surface of the fingers and toes, you've got thin skin. As you can see, it's a lot thinner. The thick skin was 0.4 to 0.6 millimeters. Here we've got basically 0.1 to 0.15 millimeters. Thick skin had sweat glands, thin skin does too, but thin skin also has hair follicles, so it can grow hair, and it also has sebaceous glands, and we'll talk about later. So here is a photomicrograph of thin skin. So notice 1, 2, 3, 4. We've got 4 layers. That stratum lucidum, that's the layer that's missing here. That's what makes this thin skin. A picture that's in your textbook, again, same thing. Differences between thick skin and thin skin. Alright, we're going to talk just a little bit about the variations, and that was the big part, was thick skin versus thin skin. Is again, just realize that you can get different variations, again, in color, in tone, in markings. It's important, but it's not as important as some other topics, so I'm going to put an X through this. Again, just realize that yes, there are reasons why either people can have variations between their skin tones in different areas, and different people can have variations in their skin color. Here would be some of the reasons why. Again, we're not going to worry about it, so you can skip these next slides. Alright, one thing that we do want to cover, again, the melanocytes produce melanin. That's protecting the skin cells, the keratinocytes, from UV radiation from the sun. And so here's kind of the clinical aspect to it is, as you probably already know, the thought is ultraviolet radiation causes skin cancer. If it mutates DNA, that can cause skin cancer. You don't have to worry about the specific wavelengths. Yes, there's 2 types of ultraviolet radiation. Sunscreens will block, hopefully, both of those types. So if they do that, they should prevent the ultraviolet radiation from reaching the DNA and mutating it. Just realize that sunless tanners create a chemical reaction with the keratin in the skin that gives it that tanned look, but they're not creating melanin. And so realize that sunless tanners don't give anyone any protection against UV radiation. You still have to use a sunscreen in that case. Alright, so the layers of the epidermis. Remember, we went from deep to superficial, so how about going superficial to deep? Corneum, lucidum if it's thin skin, pardon me, if it's thick skin, granulosum, spinosum, basal. That's superficial to deep. Alright, and the top of skin that doesn't have that second most superficial layer, that would be the thin skin. And again, it covers most of the body. Thick skin, just the hands, the feet, fingertips, the toes. Alright, so there was the epidermis. There was a superficial layer of the integumentary system. Here's the dermis. We're going to see where it's divided into two major layers. So realize the dermis is thicker than the epidermis, and thick skin, 0.6 millimeters was about as thick as it got. Here we can see where the dermis can reach a full 3 millimeters. The dermis is mostly composed of connective tissue. We had epithelial tissue up in the epidermis. Here we've got mostly connective tissue in the dermis. And so again, here was our epidermis right here. So now here's the dermis. Beneath it is going to be the subcutaneous layer. Alright, so again, epidermis up here, mostly in pink and purple tones. Here highlighted blue. Here's the dermis. Notice that it has these ridges, these arms that are shooting up and connecting with the epidermis. They're highlighted in blue here. These are dermal papillae. We'll talk about where they're important. Alright, so the dermis. Again, mostly connective tissue. So we've got collagen. This should be collagen, which is a protein. You've got elastic and reticular fibers. When we talked about tissue, elastic was stretchy. We've got dendritic cells, again serving an immune function. We had the Merkel cells that were in the epidermis that did the immune function. We've got dendritic cells here in the dermis. Here in the dermis we can also find blood vessels, sweat glands. We can also find sweat glands up in the epidermis, sebaceous glands, and again all the derivatives that are part of the integumentary system. Hair follicles, nail roots, sensory nerve endings, erector pili, those would be the muscles that make the hair stand up in the skin. All of these would be found in the dermis. The dermis is divided into two big layers. You've got the superficial papillary layer, you've got the deeper reticular layer. Alright, so the superficial layer, the papillary layer. So this one is directly up against the stratum basal of the epidermis. The papillary layer connects to the stratum basal of the epidermis. And again, basically you've got these fingers, these arms, these ridges that rise up and they go into and lock in with the stratum basal of the epidermis, and that's how the dermis and the epidermis connect to each other. So from the dermis, from the papillary layer, you've got, again, these fingers are called dermal papillae. They will interlock and fit into these epidermal ridges of the epidermis and of the stratum basal. That interdigitation, that interlocking, provides a strong connection between them. Also realize that instead of having two flat surfaces, having those papillae and those ridges increases the surface area, kind of like microvilli. And so that provides a stronger lock than if we just had two flat surfaces. Alright, the deeper layer of the dermis. So we had the papillary layer, here's the reticular layer. This one is going from the margin of the papillary layer down to the subcutaneous layer. So again, we've got connective tissue, it's a little bit different. Again, more collagen. And here's a picture that's in your textbook. So again, here's the epidermis. We've already talked about it. So here's the dermis right here, subcutaneous down here. Again, here's showing those dermal papillae, those fingers that are reaching up. Here's the epidermal ridges that are formed by the stratum basal. they're going to interlock. That's how the epidermis and the dermis connect with each other. So that is basically this layer of the dermis right here, and then the thicker part of it, here's the reticular layer. Most of the organelles, if you want to call them, most of the structures that we find in the dermis are down in the reticular layer. Alright, lines of cleavage. Here's another big one, is again, the dermis has a lot of connective tissue in it, a lot of collagen and elastic fibers. These fibers basically run along in bundles, kind of like a bunch of pipes would run along together. They're aligned along basically what would be the stress lines in normal movement of the limbs, of the muscles. They're aligned in what are called lines of cleavage. And the big thing with lines of cleavage is that it's a consideration for surgery. Is that if you make an incision along parallel to a line of surgery, that incision will typically heal quicker because there's not as much stretch, there's not as much force on it. Whereas if you make an incision or if you have a cut or a wound that's perpendicular to those cleavage lines that's going across them, that incision or that wound is more likely to gap open, and it's going to be harder to close, it's going to be harder to heal. I mean, and here's probably the best way to show it is, here's a figure in your textbook that's showing the lines of cleavage in the human body. And as you can see, they're oriented differently depending upon the region. Is again, here's one right here, here's an incision that's perpendicular, and here's an incision that's parallel to a line of cleavage. Is notice that this incision that's perpendicular, that's going against the lines of cleavage, is gaping more. It's going to require more force, it may require more sutures to close that wound, it's going to take it longer to heal, so this is actually bad. I mean, and if you're a surgeon, you want to try to make your incisions parallel, because this one's not gapping as much, it's not going to take as much force, it's not going to take as many sutures to close, and it will heal faster.